Morning, everybody. Welcome to what I think is the 10th InSport webinar. We've had a couple of weeks off for a variety of different reasons. Some of you will have seen our outstanding Women in Sport seminar series that we ran last week. That was really well attended, some brilliant immersive content in that for you. Today, though, we're going to move away from football, because we've looked at a lot of football over the last few weeks, and we're going to have a look at rugby union in particular, but actually the whole idea of the salary cap system in professional sport, generally speaking, but particularly in rugby. And I'm absolutely chuffed to be joined this morning by Dave Williams. Dave has had although you wouldn't believe it by looking at him, a 30-year career in and around the rugby union industry. You've acted and represented players. You've been involved in contract negotiations and been at the sharp end of receiving the salary cap and the challenges that might have brought. So good morning, Dave. Welcome to the InSport webinar series.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. The words sharp and me don't really go into the same sentence very often. So I'm hoping that people aren't going to expect too much, especially my focus on my camera this morning. I'm a bit misty, but it covers up the blemishes. So yes, thank you very much. I think I probably should point out that I'm not involved in being an agent anymore. I'm not a registered agent. I think my registration lapsed about 2 years ago, which I guess in some cases means that I'm not in it at the moment in terms of at the sharp end, but I don't have an axe to grind either. I'm pretty balanced. Well, at least I think so. I guess what is also relevant is, as I was an agent for 17 or 18 years or whatever it was, I also published a magazine come online newsletter called Running Rugby, which was about the business of rugby, league and union, and the finances. So I guess I'm a student of rugby as much as I am an executive.
Well, it's even better for us then. I think most of the audience, I think we've got about 50 odd people registered so far, will all be really keenly interested in your experiences. And that's, the purpose of these webinars is just to give people an immersive insight into what it's like, how sort of challenges you might have faced. So I guess the $1 million, the £1 million question, if you pardon the pun from me, is let's open up with the purpose of a salary cap. So what is a salary cap? How does it work? What are the kind of key objectives of it in your view?
Well, as far as I could tell, from a rugby point of view and from a Premiership point of view specifically, it was about, I think they probably learned the lessons of Richmond Rugby Club back in the late 90s and realised that you couldn't just throw money in there without any controls. So it was about having a balanced approach and some sort of, as we were talking earlier in the green room, about recognising that it's a league where you need checks and balances, and you can't have one guy one owner, chairman getting all excited, investing hugely, rushing off and making it a very uneven competition and then going bust. There needs to be control.
Yeah, I think this is how we'll blend into a lot of other professional team sports through this chat, because the points you've just made there are really relevant to lots of other sports. We've heard most recently about professional football in England, at least, having a look at salary cap proposals potentially. FIFA have mentioned it as well. You look at some of the American sports, obviously the salary cap idea is quite prevalent in those leagues. And when you look closer to home, we've got a salary cap in rugby league and rugby union, as you've mentioned. And one of the things there's two things actually that strike me. One is, I totally agree that we need a system where there is a level of regulation and control so that we can protect, to use a club owner's phrase that was used to me very recently, to protect those owners from themselves, because sport is so emotive, isn't it? And we often get involved in decisions that we might not naturally be involved with if we were running a small business or a medium-sized business for that matter. But there's something about sport that kind of fuels the fire and you make quite crazy decisions. So from a regulatory point of view, it helps, doesn't it? If you've got a salary cap, it will say, it should say, and I use that term should because of what we'll probably talk about later on with Saracens, it should provide a level of structure for your business to be able to meet your natural obligations. And the other side of that is it should help with the clubs in their negotiations with players and about forming a squad that will be competitive in a league environment. And I find there's always a trade-off between that competitive balance of a league and making it prosperous and the financial securities that the regulations try to provide. So is that something that you experienced during your career? Was using the salary cap something that was important to club owners, or did they see it as something they needed to get around a bit?
Well, first, I'll answer that, but I was thinking first when you were talking there that sport business, if you're a club owner in any team sport, it's not a normal business in that you're not trying to enrich the shareholders. You're not looking to make a profit. You're usually, especially in rugby's case, in football too, you've made your money and you're trying to spend it. There isn't if you're becoming a more robust business, you invest more in the business, and hopefully that's development of all the infrastructure too, and the development of the game widely in your region or your country, which I think is probably also one of the balancing factors too, isn't it? What is the true long-term objective of the club working with all the stakeholders? But yes, I agree. It's an ego trip. So it's basically you're there to obviously to everybody's got some goodwill for the game, and they wouldn't be spending a lot of their money on rugby, a lot of their hard-earned money in other sectors on building a rugby club that is some sort of symbol of their kind of what's the word, virility, if you like, financial virility. So but yeah, so they do that. It's a sensible, it seems to be a sensible, and I'd even see this from a player's point of view. The salary cap it was never challenged necessarily by the RPA or the Agents Association. We formed the ARA, Association of Rugby Agents. In times of trouble, when the war drums were sounding, you would make a big deal over various things, contractual usually. But everybody talked about it on a regular basis about challenging the salary cap. But the salary cap has kept moving up in Premiership Rugby. And it's lately, it has seemed to be kind of overtaking the sustainability of clubs to the point where before the lockdown, before the virus happened, nobody was profitable. And so the problem we've got here is that there's not consultation. So there's kind of, I don't think it's necessarily knee-jerk reaction, but hasn't been enough conversation with the players, with the collective agreement, and it's through the RPA, and it should be conducted through the RPA, because no individual player should be exposed. No club should become the kind of front line of a disagreement. It's right to kind of move it back to the union. But yes, the Saracens issue obviously did bring to be obvious that sometimes clubs need to be protected from themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm just thinking through there. What we've seen since the professionalisation of rugby is the salary cap's been implemented, and as you've said, it's ticked up, hasn't it? It's increased pretty much in line with a number of the broadcast deals that the English Premiership has been able to sign, the new owners that have come in, and the clubs that now make up the league there or thereabouts, if you include a couple of clubs that are in the Championship. All of those teams now in the Premiership are professional. They've got a good link, I think it would be fair to say, at least objectively, with most of the home unions in terms of releasing players and supporting that elite group of rugby. And we always need to remember that the pyramid of club rugby is built towards the national game, and that's quite unlike a lot of other sports that we tend to consider, particularly if we look at American sports, and if we looked at football actually to see what's what. What's been interesting there, when you look at you've highlighted the finances of rugby union there. Most of the clubs in the Premiership don't make a profit. I think there are one or two that are relatively well run. Some are very heavily supported by their owners, as we've seen. And of course, the big news this week is that the the salary cap is to come down, or at least they've agreed that it's going to come down. And you made a point there that the players' union should be involved in those negotiations because they're representing players that ultimately make the game. And I was reading a BBC article this morning that our commercial director Dan Parr posted on social media, where Damien Hopley in particular was getting a bit uptight about the fact the union hadn't been consulted, that it was restricting their earning power. And then we also heard this, the age-old argument that, well, all the players are going to disappear to a foreign country and play over there. And I think that the player he cited was George Cruz going over to Japan.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair reality? Do you think that a reduction in the salary cap in the UK or in English rugby will lead to an exodus of players? Or do you think there's a level of posturing there to try and say, you know what, folks, you really should have consulted us with this, and we may well have agreed with you, but because you haven't negotiated it with us or informed us, we're going to posture a little bit.
Well, I always sort of I cringe when this negotiation by press release happens, and you'd like to think that they've exhausted all possible diplomatic courses before they go to the press and start. But unfortunately, I think it's a bit of an entrenched situation, and it's not just entrenched in terms of the RPA and the Premiership and the Premiership and the RFU and the RPA. It's also entrenched in that if you're a rugby player of any sort of quality, you're not going to suddenly change to cycling or rowing, are you? You're stuck in rugby. It's often, as an agent, it's often more difficult to find a job for a top class player because of the value that you're looking for and the position that he has in that team than it is to find a journeyman a job or a young guy a job. So it's difficult, and it's a tight economic dynamic. So if you know that a top class tight head prop is available and coming into the market from New Zealand, for example, then all the clubs who've talked to him and might have the budget for him won't commit to another tight head prop until they've got the answer to that problem. So everybody's kind of in a queue. I think it's unrealistic when all those, when the Welsh were all, the WRU and the Welsh pro teams were worried about an exodus to France. An exodus was maybe 2 or 3 players. And it's a reality in France and Japan that they're not going to recruit foreign players unless those foreign players can bring something that their current local guys can't deliver. So in Japan, hopefully I'm not being too generalist by saying in Japan they like second rows because there aren't that many big, tall, athletic players who can play second row. They like game changers. They like pick and go number 8s, big units, and they like people who can read a game and play the game, 9, 10, and 12, for example. So they're only going to pick guys who can do a job that their current indigenous players, their current locally homegrown players aren't going to, and that's true in France too. So you won't see an exodus from anywhere. And George Cruz is in a great position because he's an international standard second row who can ask for the top money. I mean, but not many people can say that. Most people are kind of stuck in their little. And you can't in rugby. You can't just change clubs like you can in football and just hope that it just fits together perfectly. It's all about units and understanding the coach and understanding the players you work with. It's not something that should be thrown away quickly overnight.
Yeah, it's a bit of a supply and demand argument there, isn't it? I think you've just made, linking to that exodus point, that if there is a particular demand in an area, you're naturally going to be able to earn more money in that particular context. So almost regardless of the salary cap, if I used tight head prop actually at the start, if they're rare as rocking horse drop-ins, then they're naturally going to need a higher fee. And if clubs in the English Premiership aren't able to pay those sorts of fees within the cap, then it's right those players might look elsewhere. Or I think the next line of questioning is going to go down, or those clubs decide that those particular players are worth a premium in the salary cap, and of course we have the marquee signing thing, and and those types of rules, and that would leave them less money within their cap then to pay for players that are perhaps more prevalent in the market. There's a high supply of those particular players. Is that what we've seen in rugby? Have clubs used the salary cap instead of using it in a relatively fair way across a whole squad of players? Have we seen a stacking of large proportions of the cap being distributed to a small group of players, and then clubs stacking players on relatively small fees? And indeed, are they abusing then things like homegrown or academy opportunity to stack their squads with, let's say, cheaper talent?
Rob, I think you already know the answer to that question.
Remember, we've got 50 people listening. So.
Yeah. We'll pretend we haven't talked about this before. I think it's dangerous to say that you're using the cap. I mean, I think the cap is a tool. It doesn't necessarily, it's quite difficult to, I imagine it's quite difficult to administer the cap at each club, because you're trying to make these decisions on recruitment and retention. You've got guys on 1, 2, 3 year contracts, so it's quite possible that every 2 years, over 2 or 3 years, you're having to renegotiate contracts for your whole of your playing coaching staff. It's a bit of a juggling act, but yes, there was always pressure from some clubs to increase the cap. There was this idea that, okay, well, if we can't increase the cap, what about a couple of places for players? Are they bums on seats players? Are they? They're probably a little bit of both. That are they crucial game-changing players that will make a big difference? The trouble, I think, is that. So I said you can't. Rugby isn't like dropping Maradona into a team. You need a core of high-quality players. Maybe there's 10 of them. A bit like I was saying about, you need a good front row, you need some ball winners, and you need some decision makers. You can possibly get away with a squad. Most people have a squad of somewhere between 35 and 40, not including the academy players. You could possibly get away with having a squad of, subject to injury, obviously, of 10 cracking players who will get a lot of supply of ball, get a lot of territory, work teams over, and put some youngsters into the corner because they've made the space for them, out on the wings or from fullback or wherever. So I think there has been a move much towards that. I represented an ex-England player of the 2003 World Cup variety, and he was playing for Sale. And he was playing quite well. He got player of, I'm not going to mention his name, but he got player of the year in the season that they let him go. But the reasoning really was, he's great, he's doing well, but for the price we're paying him, we can get 5 20-year-old wingers in here. Yeah. And it makes sense. Does make sense.
Well, so as a staunch Gloucester rugby fan, I can remember those that time. I used to go to King's Arm quite regularly, and there was always a lot of consternation across the fans about Phil Vickery mentioning a name, because I have no association with them. That he was spending so much time playing for England that the club weren't actually getting a lot of value from him. When he came back from England duty, he was very often injured, so the club couldn't then use him. But because he was such a rare breed, he was such a talented player, he would naturally soak up more of that money in the cap. And ultimately, they released him, and he went, of course, and played for Wasps. But that decision was based on the value that Gloucester, I think, could derive from him as a player.
But also, I think
they could bring in a couple of others instead.
Yeah, but then there's also this whole. So, as you said, that the players are thinking they love Premiership action, but those sorts of players, their eye is on the World Cup or the Six Nations. It's international game is important. It's also important for the clubs in terms of their brand equity, their TV value, their ticket sales value. That you need a few. So there's a kind of balance there, isn't there, where you need a few England superstars or whichever home nation it is. You need a few young guys coming through, and you need a few hard yards pros who have had their international days, and maybe they've been imported from the South Pacific or New Zealand. And it's that you need, again, that's that whole balancing act. So I have every sympathy. Oh, firstly, I have every sympathy with clubs who are trying to balance within the salary cap, and they've got a challenge. Especially, it's all very well if the salary cap keeps going up, but can you imagine the headaches they're all having? So the chairman or the chief execs have all decided, okay, we're going to reduce it. And the playing side of the club, the guy that's running the recruitment and retention, is thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? Because he knows that it's not just a saying, okay, all the squads, we're going to reduce you. It's a negotiation and can we have a without prejudice meeting type thing with every single player of come into my office, bring your agent because we need to talk about this. It's tough.
It is, and I might ask you a controversial question now. I was involved in an interview with a guy that writes the rugby paper a couple of years ago, and we were talking about salary cap and increases. I think when it had gone to 7+ million, and I argued that actually they needed to reduce the cap to get a better distribution of players across the member clubs of the league. And of course, we were talking about the context of Saracens and the quality that they had in their squad at the time. And of course, immediately that response was, well, hang on, no, Saracens have built a squad in a particular way. They've got a set of players. They want to be dominant. They've got academy players like Maro Itoje that have come through that were now commanding higher fees. And how can that possibly work? Surely you're penalising those big clubs. And my argument was always that we need to retain a level of competitive balance in the league structure, and exactly how you've just described there. By pushing the cap down, it will naturally distribute that outstanding playing talent in smaller proportions, but across a greater number of clubs, because theoretically they can all afford to pay up to the cap. Now that's important because not all of them can afford to pay up to the cap. But the idea you kind of see following through. So so 5 or 6 guys that are outstanding, middle group of guys that are pretty good, journeyman players. You have a guy called Pete Buxton at Gloucester, proper journeyman player, outstanding. You have him in every club side, and then some of your academy kids at the bottom that will come through, and that would even the competition, so to speak. The problem, of course, with that goes back to the point about the value of the salary cap. Can clubs in the Premiership afford to pay up to the cap? Some of them we know probably can, but a number can't. And if that's the case, do you think the salary cap has an inflationary impact on player wages generally? So it makes it more difficult for clubs that can't necessarily afford to pay to the cap to pay bigger money for players?
Hold on a minute. I'm going to first
apologise.
One thing I'm going to add to that is that also, if you, I don't follow women's rugby, with any great passion necessarily, but it seems that they've introduced a salary cap in women's rugby because of the dominance of Harlequins and Saracens starting 21-22 season, that they have to get all their. It sounds ridiculous. Had to read it twice. They had to get all their salaries and benefits under £60,000 a year. That's not per player. That's the whole squad.
Wow.
So, in the interest of taking that sort of dominance of those 2 London clubs and spreading the love around the other clubs around the country. Your question. Inflationary process, yes and no, I guess. You're right. There's a central funding that each club gets. If the central and it should be, and I really do think a salary cap should be based on the income and turnover of a club, not just a nominal sum, because you're always going to get the rich clubs, however rich they are, whether it's borrowed money or borrowed from the benefactor or actually generated by the business. You're always going to get that discrepancy where some are pushing at trying to push back the barriers, and others are saying, well, wait a minute, this is getting a bit too expensive. There is an argument, which is the Moneyball argument, that says that the smart clubs have a better strategy. And so it isn't just about hitting it with a big pile of money. It's about building relationships and having a good strategy, having good coaches in place, having a good culture. Yes. So the trouble is, obviously, there's an inflationary process. If the salary cap is pushed down, I don't think there'll be a lot of huge lot of movement around, especially if that English qualified thing is still in place. But there might be some. There might be. But what's going to happen in France? It's only really England and France that drives the market value. If the economy is in England and France, so it's only really the Pro 14 follows because they need to capture decent talent, and people have got the time these days to be a little bit more selective and look at Fiji Sevens players and can we turn them into forwards and 15-a-side, for example. But if you want guaranteed people who are going to make a difference to your club, then it's going to be obvious, and those players are going to be expensive or at the top of the range.
Yeah. Comes back to the whole supply and demand thing, doesn't it? When they're that elite, you're going to have to pay for them, I guess. Just drop into the Saracens situation just for a moment. I know we've got a couple of Saracens fans on there. One of them is my friend, so he won't be happy if I don't ask you a question about Saracens. But I want to do it in the context of.
There won't be much to support next season.
No, we shouldn't laugh either. But I want to put it into the context of professional football, because obviously this week we're seeing Manchester City challenge UEFA at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And it essentially is all around financial doping, right? So investing money that regulations are saying you shouldn't really be investing, which in some way is what we're seeing at Saracens, whichever way we cut it up. Now, one of the arguments I've been battling with is actually because of the success of Saracens over the last 8-10 years, let's say, the brand of English professional rugby has improved. And because it's improved and it's been more competitive on the European stage, and they've won the European Cup, although Man City haven't done a similar thing in football yet, but they've won domestic trophies. Because of the exposure that increased playing success has given them, albeit they might have breached the rules or have breached the rules in one of those particular cases, that the whole league has benefited from that abuse of the regulations. Now, it's a tenuous point, but it's something I'm just exploring at the moment, because it's undoubtedly Saracens' success on a domestic and a European stage has improved the brand of the Premiership, has increased player quality, has increased the amount of money that's gone into a number of other clubs. And I'm almost certain that sat around that table, the chief execs and the club owners would have probably known that Saracens have been breaching the cap for a while, but perhaps allowed it because there were other benefits that came to them. It's an idea, it's a hypothesis. What are your views on that?
I'm finding it. I'm like I said, I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, but I'm finding it difficult to find to see that in any great clarity. I think it's about fairness, isn't it? Even at the top level. So it's all very well to say you don't dope, you don't cheat, because young people will be, treating you as role models. But it's also, to be fair, a bit like you said, that the clubs need to be protected from themselves to a large degree. It needs to be a fair competition. You're not going to say, isn't the Olympics great because we've got lots of doped Russians making the standard so much better.
Yeah.
It needs to be fair, and it needs to be seen to be fair. And I think that was I didn't celebrate Saracens being pinged, well, more than pinged, being taken to task for cheating. But I did think it's a great breakthrough for rugby, because there'd been transgressions in the past, but they'd sanctioned it privately. It was the only rugby salary cap that nobody had ever been publicly sanctioned for, and that was a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
And I do think perhaps it's CVC coming in and wanting to make things clearer, because they've made this, value call. The first time that somebody who wasn't a club owner is involved in the decision-making process. Maybe they were just sick of slapping wrists and telling people not to be naughty and don't say anything about it. But yes, I think it's important that it's seen to be fair. Otherwise, what's the point in having it? It was becoming a bit of a joke that there was this salary cap, and it was if you're a player talking about renewing your contract and the salary cap is used as an excuse not to give you a rise, you feel like, well, hold on a minute, that you're not keeping to the salary cap, or nor are these clubs, and so it's just invented for their own ill-gotten ways.
Yeah, it brings us back quite nicely actually to that integrity of competition and that competitive balance we were bouncing around with earlier on. If you've got that set of regulations, then it should improve the fairness of the competition. I think the balance, therefore, is to try and determine a level of cap. And you talked about it actually. You talked about the cap based on income or turnover because actually that would be more achievable. You probably need to take a midpoint somewhere in the league to give some of those smaller clubs a bit of aspirational headroom, but also some of those bigger clubs an opportunity to try and have a natural order of how things tend to work in professional sport, because the biggest teams should generate a bit more money and therefore should be more successful on the field.
And maybe there's a so I made a note earlier about as the economies of rugby change in this country, about ring fencing and franchise model. And then when you're talking about how the mid-table teams need a little bit of a bunk up, I'm thinking we're going back to this player draft system, aren't we? So so the championship funding from the RFU has been largely removed. So we really don't have a likely scenario where any club apart from that 13th club is going to go up and down all the time. So it might as well, it's a de facto ring fencing system anyway. That why not? And then why not have a system where everybody's you have a salary cap that's fair to everyone, maybe based on turnover, but you also have some sort of draft choice where you're importing foreign talent from overseas. I know my agent friends won't like the idea of that because that makes it an open market where everybody knows, and the whole thing is based on clandestine meetings and telephone calls and secrecy. But no, it's interesting looking at other models and seeing how they work. I would say that the French model is quite good because it's about each French club in the top 14 and in and D2 as well, they have to submit their budget for the year to the LNR and say, this is what we're looking to spend based on how much money we're getting in revenue, forecast revenue, obviously based realistic on previous year's turnover. And if they're looking to spend more, so progress and invest in the development of the club, whatever it is, then they need to put money aside and show where the money is going to come from to fit that shortfall. Mm-hmm. And they, unlike the Premiership until recently, they actually have punished quite hard people who have cheated that system, and seems to work quite well. Yeah,
I think I am. When I think about my own personal position, I think the salary cap idea is probably a good one. You're always going to get a situation where clubs try and bend the rules a little bit, but there's probably a bit of headroom to do that here and there. I'm conscious of time, and we always try and keep these to about half an hour. So I've, as per usual, overrun a little bit. I'm sure the people that have tuned in don't necessarily mind. Dave, if you've got a couple more minutes, just want to run through a couple of questions from the question box, if that's okay. And I'm going to try and moderate them as I go through because we might have picked up a few things already. So first question that's got a couple of votes. Can a salary cap in England work on its own? I.e., do we need some sort of World Rugby salary cap to help protect the world game, and should an English one fit into that, do you think?
It sounds like a big job. I'm not sure if it's workable. I think the way that the World Rugby is structured is they like to delegate. It's a kind of trickle down effect, and they want each union to be in charge of what happens in their own rugby territories. Mm-hmm. And obviously, it's the RFU. The RFU don't tell the Premiership they need to have a salary cap. They just regulate when they think things are going badly for rugby.
Yeah,
it's a commercial. It's a commercial imperative, isn't it? It's not a governing body thing. It's the league themselves that decide, which is why the Championship don't have a salary cap. It's the Premiership who have a salary cap, and they've agreed it amongst the 12 or 13 clubs. Yeah.
It's one of these interesting disparities again, isn't it, between this kind of American model of professional team sport and a European one, where European team sport seem to have borrowed some of the things they think were good in the States, but because we have promotion relegation, which they tend not to have in the States because of the franchise system. It makes it much more difficult to actually apply, and then you need to try and generate some fairness through the system, which probably brings me on to the next question. Not sure who this is from. If I try and match up icons, I think it's from Rob Marshall, but I might be totally wrong. Should English rugby have a draft system, much like basketball in America, which you've kind of referred to? So the academies, therefore, would need to be run by the RFU rather than the clubs themselves.
Yeah, draft system. I was thinking of a draft system for foreign players coming in rather than homegrown. In a way, yeah, it's an interesting one. So the trouble with rugby is that you develop at a different rate. So if you're a winger or a scrum half, you could be playing when you're 18, 19. But if you're a front five forward, you're not likely to be there till you're 23. So at what point does this draft thing happen? I certainly think there are some good and bad practices in terms of sharing out the talent, because you might run an academy, a Premiership academy, and have 2 great scrum halves coming through, or 2 great open side flankers, and not sure what to do with them because you can't introduce 2 young guys at the same time. So it's being managed relatively well. And if you think about it, the Premiership and the RFU do combine on academy development, because it is really about the development of the underage teams at 16 and 18 and 20. So there is quite a bit of management. Whether that's the value, it's this whole idea of a controlled system versus a free market, isn't it? I'm not necessarily a great fan of globalization and the free market economy, but you've got to let some sort of freedom and let some sort of settling down. How do you find you're let go by a club? How do you find the next club? You're not going to trust the RFU or your current club that's getting rid of you to find a job for you. So you kind of, as a player or an agent, need to go out there and address the market.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions on this actually dropping through the question and answer page. So I hope to everybody that's listening, we're answering some of these as we go through rather than asking them all specifically. There is definitely something in here. David Barrett makes the point. If a salary cap is about increasing competitive balance, don't we need to include other measures like player draft, ring fencing, top division, etc., which you've just kind of alluded to? I guess for me, that questions the nature and the objective of the salary cap itself, because whilst we've talked a bit about competitive balance on this call, it's a very theoretical position to take, and I doubt very much that the English Premiership or any of the other professional team sports have used a salary cap to deliver competitive balance outcomes. I think it's more about cost control, isn't it, and trying to ensure financial sustainability.
And plus, there are some non-financial areas to being a competitive team. One of my favourite stories is about Warren Gatland when he was at Wasps. And I don't think he'd mind me saying so. When he was at Wasps, they were winning a lot of silverware, and I represented 6 or 7 of those guys at the time. And when contract time came around, we always want more. I mean, it's the business of more. Business is about more, isn't it? So, and he would say, "Well, Dave, you go out there and find out how much it's going to cost your player to stay at Wasps," because they wouldn't go. Worcester was always the great joke. Go to Worcester and see how much they're going to pay, and they would. Worcester would be paying 25% more, but you'd like, well, I want to stay around here because I'm at the sharp end. So you had that. I think Saracens Saracens also had a very good culture and they were winning.
Yeah.
There was that kind of aspect to it when the information had come out about the salary cap and other Premiership clubs were saying, well, I thought there might be something wrong because we were offering such and such and it was, I can't believe that that player stayed and got paid more than what we offered. And I was thinking, well, they're not necessarily staying because they're being paid more. They're staying because it's a successful environment. They're winning cups. Why move? Why move for 20 grand, 30 grand, 50 grand? It's interesting.
Yeah, especially when some of your businesses are tied up with your employer as well, potentially.
Yeah. If your boss owns your house, it's a bit difficult to move, isn't it?
Yeah. Right, I'm going to ask you one more question, if that's okay, and it's from somebody that we've had on the show before as a guest. So I always try and make sure we ask these sorts of questions, and it will bring us back to football and this kind of idea of how professional team sports work. So Gregory, who's a sport law expert, came on a few weeks ago, has asked, do you think the introduction of a salary cap in football in England will be successful? Unless there is regulation to the contrary, salary cap limitations may be bypassed by an increase in things like image rights and other personality rights. So what's your thoughts? Do you think it could work in another professional sport in the UK? What do you think the benefits and pitfalls are?
I think there's already a financial fair play thing going on, isn't there, and a guideline to how a club needs to run itself. I think that you need to take that image rights offshore payment type thing into account when you're measuring the salary cap. I think one of the issues is if you're governing or regulating the cap within a country, you don't have access to accounts and information and arm's length deals outside of the UK, and that's quite a difficult thing to control. That any kind of cheating, the cheaters are always like one step ahead of the last set of regulations that get puts in. I also have visions of board meetings at Premiership Rugby where they're agreeing the salary cap, and they're all kind of agreeing the new terms and how do we deal with this, how do we deal with that. But under the table, they're kind of making little notes about how they're gonna get around it, which is so. Again, they need to be protected from themselves. Do I think it could work? I think it in a way in football it already has in terms of this financial fair play. There are different ways of going about it. I think evolutionary is better than revolutionary, and I think that's the problem with this whole kind of salary cap reduction thing with Premiership Rugby, is that it's happened too quickly without any proper consultation with all the stakeholders, and not everybody's going to be happy, obviously, are they? But if there is a reputational problem or a danger of people losing their livelihoods and companies going bust, nobody wants that sort of volatility. So it kind of makes sense that over time you introduce measures that balances it out without taking away the competition, because obviously sport is about competition.
Yeah, Dave, that was expertly brought back to the whole point of the webinar, and I think that's a really good place to leave it. Listen, it's been wonderful for me to listen to some of your stories, your anecdotes, your insights. As a keen rugby union fan myself, it's always nice to talk to a like-minded individual. I think our listeners will have got a lot from that as well, particularly given some of the news we've seen this week. When I end the broadcast, it will unceremoniously just dump us both out of things. So on behalf of myself and InSport and everybody that's listened, thank you very much, Dave. It's been brilliant.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. I've over this lockdown period, I've been enjoying lots of free sessions like this myself. So I feel like it's good to give a little bit back. I hope I answered some questions that were interesting to people.
Yeah, spot on. I think we'll probably get a few comments now saying thanks very much. I'll end the broadcast now, Dave. Again, thanks very much. Pleasure to meet you on screen.
Cheers.
And take care.
Okay. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.